Before it was a village, Black Hollow was just trees, tall, tangled, and whispering. The kind of woods where even the wind seemed to lose its way. There were no roads then, only trails made by animals and forgotten things. The stories say the forest chose its own shape, and the shape it chose was a circle, tight and secret, like a mouth waiting to speak. The first settlers built their homes on the outer rim of the hollow, careful never to build too deep. They told themselves it was the marshy ground, or the uneven roots, or the way compasses didn't seem to work quite right in the center of the woods. But really, it was the feeling. A quiet watching. The way the trees leaned inward, listening. And always, always, the light. Because every night, whether in snow or rain, thunder or silence, a lantern glowed in the heart of the woods. No one lit it. No one claimed it. And yet, it was always there. Hanging from a crooked iron hook buried deep among the trees, the lantern swung gently back and forth like a cradle. It burned golden and soft, never bright enough to see by, never dim enough to disappear. Just there, like a breath between sentences. At first, people tried to ignore it. Then, over the years, they simply accepted it. Children made up stories about it, that it marked the grave of a lost traveler, or that it was carried by a ghost who had forgotten what he was searching for. Some said it only lit up when someone was about to die, but no one could ever prove that. Maeve had always known about the lantern. She lived at the edge of the village, in a crooked old house where the attic window faced the forest. Each night, after her parents had fallen asleep, she would curl up beneath the eaves with a blanket and watch it. The light was far off, but she could always see it, that gentle sway, like a heartbeat in the dark. It never moved closer. Never went out. But still, it called to her. Not in words. Not in sound. Just, in feeling. A quiet tug just behind her ribs. A strange warmth in her palms. And sometimes, when the wind came from the forest, she swore she could smell burnt paper and violets. Maeve told no one. The village had grown practical over time. The hollow tales were still passed around, warnings and wonders whispered by firelight, but most adults dismissed them as bedtime nonsense. And Maeve, though young, had learned that some things were better left unsaid. Still, the pull grew stronger. And one night, just as the moon slipped behind a cloud and the shadows turned silver, Maeve stood. She padded quietly across her wooden floor, careful not to wake the house. She wrapped herself in her thickest coat, laced her boots tight, and stepped into the cold. She didn't bring a lantern. She didn't need one. The one in the forest was already waiting. Maeve crossed the old stone bridge just before midnight. The village was far behind her now, its chimneys slumbering, its streets blanketed in frost. The only sound was her breath, slow and steady, and the faint crunch of leaves beneath her boots. The woods seemed to lean inward as she walked, branches curling toward her like fingers eager to listen. And then she saw it. The lantern. It was even more beautiful up close. Suspended from a crooked iron hook planted in the earth, it swung with no wind, casting soft golden light that didn't touch the trees around it. The flame inside didn't flicker. It shimmered, steady, slow, rhythmic, like something alive. Below it sat a single wooden chair. Simple. Unpainted. Worn with time. It looked like it had been there for decades, maybe longer. The ground beneath it was bare, no leaves, no roots, no moss. Just dirt, smooth and dark, like it had been swept clean. Maeve stepped closer, heart quickening. The lantern buzzed faintly as if it recognized her. And then, without quite knowing why, she sat. The moment she did, the forest stopped. No birds. No wind. Even the trees froze, their branches silenced midsway. A hush fell so complete it felt like the whole world had taken a breath and was waiting to hear something. The lantern brightened. And the stories began, not spoken aloud, not in any voice she recognized. They came as feelings, like emotions she had never felt before but somehow understood. Images swirled behind her eyes, vivid and strange, a thief who dreamed every night of the people he had stolen from, and awoke each morning with a new scar across his heart. A girl who could taste people's memories like flavors, joy was honey, sorrow was burnt cinnamon, regret tasted like cold tea. A house with no doors, only windows that showed different versions of the world, depending on who was looking. She didn't write these stories. Not yet, but she felt them settle in her chest like stones in a riverbed. The longer she sat, the more the lantern seemed to pulse with warmth, not heat, but presence. As though it was watching her. Or more than that, remembering her. After what could have been minutes or hours, Maeve stood. The moment she left the chair, the sound of the forest returned, slowly, like music drifting back after a pause. The lantern dimmed. The swing slowed. And then, it sighed. Not loudly. Not with breath. But with that same quiet exhale that trees make just before snow falls. A soft release. As though the clearing had been holding something in, and now let it go. Maeve walked home without speaking. She didn't look back. But when she reached the edge of the woods, she glanced over her shoulder. The lantern still glowed. The chair sat empty, and for just a moment, she thought she saw a second lantern farther in, deeper in the woods, just a flicker, there and gone. She went to bed without telling anyone. But she didn't sleep. She listened. Maeve woke at dawn with soil on her hands and words in her head. She hadn't dreamed. Not exactly. But something had been pressing against the edge of her thoughts all night, like pages fluttering in wind. When she opened her eyes, she knew them. Not just words. Stories. She wrote the first one in the corner of an old receipt from her coat pocket. It came out in a rush, as if it had been waiting inside her all along. The man in the mirror doesn't blink. Not anymore. He waits for you to forget which side you're on. She stared at it, breathless. The handwriting was hers. The ink familiar, but the thought, the voice, didn't feel like hers at all. More followed. She wrote on anything she could find, receipts, napkins, envelopes, scraps of torn wallpaper, even the edges of books she no longer read. The stories came uninvited, but never unkindly. Some were short, only a sentence or two. Others poured out like ink from a cracked bottle. Maeve didn't plan them. She didn't think. She just listened. And the strange thing was, they were good. Frightening, yes. Odd, absolutely. But beautiful in their way, like old lullabies you almost remember. She didn't mean to share them. But she began slipping them into the world, without thinking why. A story tucked into a breadbasket at the market. Another left inside the cover of a returned library book. A warning pinned to a lamppost, don't pick up the coin on Hollow Street. It's not unlucky. It's lonely. People found them. And whispered. They called them the Hollow Tales. They passed them from hand to hand like treasures. They read them aloud at the tavern, left them folded in coat pockets and slipped between fence slats. No one knew where they came from. Maeve never signed them. But their words spread like fire whispered to frost. Some claimed the tales were cursed. Others said they kept you safe, that reading one aloud could stop bad dreams. A few said you shouldn't read them aloud, because something listened when you did. Maeve said nothing. Just kept writing. Until one day, she found a tale she didn't remember writing, folded gently beneath her pillow, the ink fresh, the words simple. She watches the lantern, but never wonders who watches her. Maeve. Her breath caught. She hadn't written that. She was sure of it. And yet, the pen on her desk was still warm. The ink on the note matched hers. The paper came from her journal, the page torn so cleanly, so carefully. Outside her attic window, the lantern burned brighter that night. Not wildly. Not alarmingly. But it no longer swayed. It hung perfectly still, as if leaning closer. As if listening now, not to the forest, but to her. The lantern no longer swayed. That stillness haunted Maeve more than anything else. It was as if the flame itself had turned to watch her, not wildly, not with threat, but with a patient, deliberate attention, the kind that waits at the end of a question. The forest hadn't changed. Not outwardly. The trees still whispered, the moss still grew soft beneath the birches, and the air still carried the scent of damp pine and something sweeter, like burnt sugar left too long on the stove. But Maeve felt it in her bones, something had shifted. And so, for the second time, she returned. She didn't tell anyone. Not her parents, who had grown quiet lately. Not her classmates, who never noticed her much. She waited until the world was wrapped in dark, then slipped out with a notebook in one pocket and a glass bottle in the other, an old jar with a cork, just in case something wanted catching. She didn't know why she brought it. It felt like something the forest might ask for. When she reached the lantern, it was still there, golden and glowing, still as a held breath. The crooked iron hook was cold to the touch, and beneath it sat the same old chair, empty but waiting. Maeve sat. This time, no visions came. No stories spilled from the light. Only silence. Not quiet, silence. No rustling. No owls. No wind. Just a vast, endless hush that pressed in from all sides. It wrapped around her shoulders like a heavy cloak and pushed into her ears like deep water. Then she heard it. A click. Faint. Sharp. Like a door unlocking. Maeve turned. Slowly. Her heart ticking like a metronome. Behind her, between two old trees she swore hadn't been there before, stood a second lantern. Smaller. Dimmer. It flickered, unlike the first. As if uncertain of itself. And next to it stood a girl. She was Maeve's height. Maeve's shape. She even wore Maeve's clothes, but older, faded, as if left out in the weather too long. Her face was hidden beneath a veil of black lace, delicate and trembling with every breath of wind, but Maeve felt the gaze behind it, sharp and mirrored. The girl said nothing. Maeve opened her mouth to speak, but the words dried on her tongue. The silence wouldn't let them go. So Maeve nodded. And the girl nodded back. Then, slowly, the veiled girl reached into the folds of her coat and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. She held it out. Maeve rose from the chair. The moment her boots touched the soil, the stillness deepened, like walking into the pause before thunder. She stepped forward. The girl did not move, only held the paper out until Maeve took it. The girl's hand was cold. Not dead cold. Else cold. And then she was gone. No flicker. No step. Just not there anymore. The second lantern, too, vanished like steam. Maeve was alone again. She opened the paper slowly, carefully. Inside, scrawled in thin, slanted handwriting, were 3 words: "Do not stay." No signature. No date. Just those 3 words. Maeve looked at the chair. Then the lantern. Then the trees that leaned a little too closely now. She didn't sit again. Instead, she turned and walked back toward home. Her boots didn't echo. Her breath didn't fog. And behind her, though she dared not look back, she knew the lantern had begun to sway again. But now, it swung faster. In the morning, Maeve noticed the birdsong was wrong. It wasn't gone, not entirely, but off. The sparrows sang slightly too fast. The crows called in odd patterns, like they were spelling something in a language she didn't speak. Even the wind through the leaves carried a different rhythm, one that didn't match the breath of the forest she thought she knew. She sat at her desk, the note still in her hand. Do not stay. The ink had faded overnight. Almost like it didn't want to remain. Like it wasn't meant to last outside the hollow. Maeve tucked it inside her notebook, pressed between 2 blank pages, and stared out the attic window. The lantern had stopped swaying again. Not with stillness but with intention. It was waiting. At school, the air buzzed strangely. Her classmates whispered more than usual. One girl mentioned a missing cat, another swore their kitchen clock had turned backward and stayed that way. Someone found a coin in their sock drawer with no date stamped on either side. No one connected the dots. But Maeve felt them connecting. She went back that night. Again. This time not out of curiosity, but because something inside her was unraveling. like thread being gently tugged by invisible fingers. The lantern greeted her before she saw it, with a soft warmth that pulsed against her ribs. She stepped into the clearing. The chair was gone. The hook remained, holding the lantern in place, but the chair, which had always been there, always, had vanished. In its place, the earth had been disturbed. Not dug. Not broken. Just shifted, like something had stood up from a long sleep. The air was still. Maeve took a careful step forward, eye scanning the trees. And then she saw it. A tree she didn't recognize, though she had walked this path dozens of times. Its bark was smooth and dark, not rough and mottled like the others. And at its base, just large enough for a person to crawl through, was a door. Not a wooden one. Not carved or hinged. A natural door. The trunk split open at the base, hollowed like a mouth mid-sentence, leading down into dark. It hadn't been there yesterday. Or ever. She moved closer. The lantern's light didn't reach this far, but somehow, she could see the entrance clearly. The edges of the hollow shimmered faintly, pulsing like veins just beneath skin. Beside the door lay another note, pinned under a stone. Do not knock. It already hears you. Maeve's breath caught. For Maeve? She crouched beside the door. The air drifting from within was cool and damp, like the inside of a cave. She could hear something faint, not voices, but pages. Turning slowly. Like a book being read by unseen hands. She wanted to go in. But the note weighed heavy in her pocket. Do not stay. So instead, she did something she hadn't done before. She spoke. Just 3 words, soft as thread, I hear you. The sound vanished into the hollow. No echo. No response. But something changed. The ground beneath her hummed, subtle and deep, as though the hollow had acknowledged her. Then, gently, the tree began to close. The bark flowed like wax, knitting together with slow certainty until the door was no more. Only a smooth trunk remained, with no sign it had ever parted. Maeve stood, stunned. Behind her, the lantern flickered once. Then dimmed. And far off, deeper in the woods, a second lantern flared to life. It burned blue. Maeve didn't sleep that night. She lay in bed with the covers pulled to her chin, staring at the ceiling as the faint flicker of the blue lantern haunted the edges of her mind. It hadn't been gold like the others. It hadn't swung gently or pulsed softly like a breath. It had burned still and sharp, as though the forest itself were holding its breath around it. Blue like frostbite. Blue like the veins in a sleeping wrist. Blue like a warning. By morning, the sky was thick with gray. Not clouds, not exactly. Just an unnatural dimness that left the village a few shades duller. People spoke more softly. The dogs barked less. Even the crows had gone quiet. Maeve's mother noticed. You're pale, she said. Are you eating enough? Maeve nodded. But her hands trembled when she lifted her spoon. She left early for school and didn't go there at all. Instead, she walked the path through the forest again. Not to the first lantern, the one by the iron hook and the missing chair, but deeper. Past the place where the tree had opened, past the stone where the veiled girl had stood. Into the hollow's breath. And the deeper she went, the stranger the forest became. The trees no longer grew quite right. Some leaned inward so tightly they formed arches over her path. Others had bark split into spiraling symbols she didn't recognize, not carvings, but growth. Natural patterns that looked like letters written by something with too many fingers. The birds were gone here. No rustling. No wind. Just the sound of her footsteps, and, faintly, that quiet hum. Like pages turning behind a closed door. Finally, she reached the place. The second clearing. No hook here. No chair. Just the blue lantern, suspended in midair, with nothing holding it up. It floated just above eye level, utterly still, its flame as motionless as ice. No smoke. No sway. A tear of color against the grayscale world. And beneath it, carved directly into the forest floor, was a spiral. Not drawn. Not painted. Grown, as though the roots of the forest had twisted themselves into this symbol over decades. It pulsed faintly. Not with magic, exactly. With memory. Maeve knelt beside it. Something in her wanted to place her hand in the center. To see what it remembered. But then. A whisper. So faint, she almost missed it. At first she thought it came from the lantern. Then the trees. Then her own ears. But no. It came from the spiral. One word, spoken in a breath that wasn't wind. Return. She flinched back. The lantern blinked, just once, and suddenly the spiral darkened, as though wet ink had been spilled into its center. The ground trembled. Then the flame flared. In it, for a heartbeat, she saw a face. Her face. But older. Hollow-eyed, lips sewn shut with thread. Then the lantern went out. The clearing fell into darkness. Not night dark, void dark. The kind of dark that forgets light ever existed. Maeve backed away. Her heart raced. Then, from somewhere behind her, came a sharp snap, like a bone breaking underfoot. She turned, but nothing was there. And then she heard it again, the sound of pages turning. Faster now. Something was getting closer. Maeve turned and ran, the dark chasing her like a second skin. She didn't look back. Didn't breathe. She followed her feet, barely seeing, barely thinking, until at last she burst from the trees into the edge of the familiar forest. The first lantern was gone. So was the hook. Only the empty air swayed now. But tucked into the hollow where the iron stake had once been was a scrap of paper. Maeve picked it up with shaking fingers. In her own handwriting, it read, "You opened the page. Now you must read the ending." The forest was not the same. Maeve had walked these trails since she was small, the dirt paths winding like ribbons, the mossy stones soft underfoot, the trees familiar as friends. But after the blue lantern vanished and the clearing went dark, even the memory of the forest began to rot. She noticed it first in the trees. Hay leaned wrong. Not just bent or weather-worn, but curved toward her, as though every trunk had turned slightly to watch. Bark patterns formed faces if you stared too long. Once, she swore she saw an eye blink just above the knot of an old birch. The spiral from the second clearing had branded itself into her mind, and sometimes when she blinked, she saw it on her skin, just below the wrist, pulsing like a heartbeat. It vanished when she looked directly at it. Her stories changed too. The hollow tales, once eerie but poetic, now turned violent. Meaner, like they were warning someone, or something, away. Or worse, inviting. One appeared taped to her window in the middle of the night. It read, "Don't trust the one who looks like you. It wants out." Another, left inside her coat pocket, simply said, "They remember." And then, on the morning after the blue flame, she woke up to find the mirror in her attic had cracked. Not shattered, just a hairline split straight down the center. As though the reflection itself had begun to divide. She stared at it. In her reflection, her room was unchanged. But her face, the reflection smiled. Maeve did not. She covered the mirror with a sheet and left the attic. By dusk, she returned to the woods, though everything in her screamed not to. But it was no longer a question of choice. The hollow had begun to pull at her, not like a storm, but like gravity, and she needed to know what lay at the center of that pull. She took the narrow path behind the second clearing, one she hadn't noticed before, though it was clearly old. Stones lined the sides like fallen teeth. The air thinned. The sounds of the world faded to muffled hushes, like she was walking underwater. After what felt like hours, she reached the mirror woods. She knew it instantly. Every tree here bore a smooth silver sheen, as though the bark had turned to polished glass. When she passed between them, she saw reflections on all sides, twisted, warping, repeating. Her face multiplied and folded in on itself like origami. But one of them wasn't warped. It stared back at her, perfect and still. Maeve stopped. Her throat tightened. The reflection stood in a tree to her right, her same height, same clothes, same smudge of ink on her left wrist, but it didn't move when she did. It stood completely still. Then, slowly, it lifted its hand and touched the inside of the glass bark. Maeve lifted hers in response, drawn like a puppet. Their palms met, separated only by the mirrored surface. Her breath caught. Then, without warning, the reflection smiled. A long, slow, knowing smile that didn't reach its eyes. Maeve staggered back. The smile widened. Then the reflection leaned closer, impossibly close, and whispered something from inside the glass. Maeve couldn't hear it. But her ears rang. And then, deep inside the forest behind the mirrored tree, a lantern lit. Not gold. Not blue. Black. A dark lantern with no flame, only shadow. It drank the light around it. The trees tilted toward it. The mirrored reflection vanished. And Maeve knew, this was no longer a story she was telling. This was a story telling her. For days, Maeve avoided the woods. She stayed indoors, drew the curtains, and unplugged every mirror in the house. Her reflection couldn't be trusted. She'd seen what it did when it thought she wasn't watching, how it blinked wrong, how it moved just a breath too slow, like it was struggling to stay synced. She kept every light on at night. But the dark still found her. She'd hear it outside her window, not footsteps, but pages, whispering as they turned. Soft as leaves, steady as breath. Once, she even found a trail of salt leading from her attic down to the basement. No one in the house admitted to leaving it. When she gathered the courage to check the woods from a distance, the lanterns were gone. All of them. The gold, the blue, even the black one she swore had never lit. Only the spiral still remained, carved into her dreams, into the forest floor, and, sometimes, into her shadow. And yet, despite the fear that wrapped around her ribs like ice, she couldn't stay away. It wasn't obsession. It wasn't even curiosity. It was inevitability. One evening, when the sky turned that deep violet just before full dark, she felt something shift. A soundless cracking in her chest, as though a door, not real, not made of wood, had opened inside her. She packed a bag, notebook, flashlight, the old corked jar, and the note that read you opened the page. Now you must read the ending. She walked into the hollow without hesitation. This time, it greeted her. The moment she passed the first birch, the air thickened. The trees leaned back, not forward, as if giving her space. No wind. No birds. Just the sound of soil under her boots, and something far below, like a low chanting just beneath hearing. She returned to the mirror woods. This time, the reflections watched openly. They no longer tried to hide. Some turned to follow her, their heads tilting in unison, their eyes black and bottomless. But none moved from their silver prisons. Then she found the spiral again, not carved in bark, but burned into the earth itself, like it had been branded with fire. And there, in its center, was a hole. Just wide enough to crawl into. Maeve stared down into it. It smelled of ink and old paper. A buried library. A tomb made of pages. Without a word, she slipped the flashlight between her teeth, got on her hands and knees, and entered the dark. The tunnel was tight at first. Dirt brushed her shoulders. Roots scraped her back. But soon it widened into a chamber so still, so quiet, that even her breath felt like an intruder. And in the center of that earthen hollow sat a single book. No shelves. No lanterns. Just the book. It was massive, the size of a suitcase, bound in dark leather that shimmered faintly with the sheen of beetle wings. No title on the cover. No lock. Just a single bookmark peeking from the center, made of something pale and fine. Not ribbon. Not thread. Hair. Maeve approached. Her hands trembled as she reached out. The moment her fingers touched the cover, the ground breathed. Not shook. Not cracked. Just exhaled, a deep, slow sigh from beneath the world. She opened the book. And the pages were filled with her own handwriting. Stories. Drawings. The spiral. The lanterns. The girl in the veil. All of it, from her own notebook, only now written in ink the color of dusk, not black, not blue. But the pages did not end. As she turned them, they went on, and on, and on, things she had never written. Memories she didn't have. Places she hadn't yet seen. Until she found the final page. The only blank one. At the bottom, written in sharp script, the one who writes the end must be the end. And then, from the tunnel behind her, came the sound of pages turning. Fast. Something was coming. Something she had written, maybe even summoned. Maeve grabbed the hair-marked bookmark and tore it free. The book screamed, not loudly, but with a force that shook the marrow in her bones. The walls cracked. Roots bled ink. And behind her, the tunnel darkened. Maeve held the jar in one hand and did the only thing she could think of. She whispered, "I refuse the ending." And slammed the jar shut. For a second, everything froze. The whispering stopped. The ink retracted. The spiral carved itself into the glass of the jar, glowing faintly like a wound still healing. Maeve climbed out of the tunnel, jar in hand. Behind her, the spiral sealed, and somewhere, far in the hollow's heart, a new lantern flickered to life. Not gold. Not blue. Not black. This one burned white. Maeve did not speak for 3 days. She stayed in bed with the curtains drawn, the corked jar on her nightstand. Sometimes she'd glance at it and see the spiral glowing softly within, as though it breathed. Other times, the glass went dark and cold, and her reflection in the jar's curve wouldn't blink when she did. She didn't write. She didn't draw. She didn't dream, or if she did, the dreams were taken before morning. But she felt it. The white flame. It was different from the others. The gold lantern had lured her. The blue had shown her the cracks in the world, the black had tried to replace her. But this one, it watched. And it waited. On the 3rd day, she heard a knock. Not at the door. At her mirror. The covered one in the attic. Slow. Patient. Hollow, like fingers wrapped in cloth. Maeve stood at the bottom of the attic steps for nearly an hour before she moved. She clutched the jar in one hand. With the other, she slowly creaked open the door and climbed into the dust-heavy silence. The knock had stopped. She peeled the sheet away. The mirror was not cracked anymore. It was perfect. Too perfect. It reflected her attic, yes, the floorboards, the old trunk, the windows, but not her. She didn't appear. The space where she should have stood was empty. Then a face leaned into view from the edge of the glass. Not hers. It wore her eyes. But its mouth was wrong. Sewn shut with dark thread that twitched when it smiled. And in its hand, it held a small white lantern. Lit. Maeve stumbled back. The figure lifted the lantern and pressed it against the inside of the glass. The mirror warmed, and then, impossibly, the glass melted into water, rippling outward from the point of contact. It became a pool, suspended upright. A doorway of liquid silver. Something inside it turned a page. Maeve grabbed the corked jar. She didn't know what she intended to do. Trap it? Feed it? Bury it again? But the spiral glowed brighter. Brighter than before. And this time, it pulsed in rhythm to something outside the jar. From deep inside the mirror door, a voice spoke. Not aloud. Inside her. Come now. The hollow must be finished. She shook her head. But her feet had already moved closer. The attic grew cold. The light bent toward the glass. Behind the mirror, the attic stretched on, infinite and forested. A second world. A story not yet sealed, and above the rippling doorway, new words etched themselves in fine frost. Chapter 10, The Hollow Heart. Maeve's breath caught. The mirror was not a reflection. It was a book. And she had just turned the page. The mirror didn't shatter when Maeve stepped through. It folded. One ripple, like a pond pierced by a single raindrop, and she was inside. The attic vanished. Her house. The town. The world she knew. Now she stood in the deepest part of the forest, a clearing so wide it seemed to have no edge. The trees encircling it were unlike any she'd seen, white as bone, bark patterned in spirals that shimmered faintly in 1,000 hues of gray. No leaves. No birds. Just quiet, ancient air, still asleep. At the center stood a stone altar, old and cracked, covered in etchings that moved when she wasn't looking directly at them. Behind it rose a great tree, or what had once been a tree, twisted into the shape of a tower, its branches clawing at the colorless sky like fingers too long to belong to anything human. This was the hollow heart. She felt it in her spine. She stepped forward. The jar pulsed in her hand. As she approached the altar, she saw it held a book. The same one she'd found beneath the earth, massive, leather-bound, marked with a new bookmark, a black ribbon threaded with red thread. But this time, the book was open. It did not flutter. It did not whisper. It breathed. Each page rose and fell slowly, as if it were sleeping. Then it spoke, not in words, but in the way a wound speaks when it reopens. And Maeve saw a vision. She saw the first lantern lit by a faceless woman with hands made of bone and bark. She saw her riding into the woods with blood, creating doors where none should exist. She saw children walk through, some returned. Some didn't. She saw the hollow choose Maeve, not because she was special, but because she was empty enough to be filled. She saw herself, older, standing in this very place, writing stories with ink that wept. And then she saw the truth. There were never different lanterns. There was only one. It changed with the story being told. And the story was no longer hers. It was trying to write her out. A sharp pain lanced through her palm. Maeve looked down. The jar had cracked. Thin hairline fractures webbed across the glass, and inside, the spiral glowed bright white, then gold, then flickered like fire dying. The story was near its end. And the book, the hollow heart, wanted her final line. Maeve stepped forward and placed the jar on the altar beside the book. It hissed, like oil on flame. The book's pages turned faster, a whirlwind of motion, each page covered in versions of herself, younger, older, stitched, shadowed, all reaching toward her. She pulled the ribbon bookmark free. The forest screamed. The altar cracked. And the voice came again, in her own tongue, in her own pitch, write it. End it. Or become it. Maeve stepped back. No, she whispered. Not this way. And then, she did what the hollow didn't expect. She closed the book. Silence. Real silence. The first true quiet she'd felt in weeks. The spiral stopped glowing. The jar dimmed. The trees around the clearing began to crack and bend, twisting back toward the sky like reversing a time-lapse of something dying. The hollow heart groaned. Not in anger, in disbelief. Maeve turned. And behind her stood the mirror. Waiting. The reflection inside was no longer smiling. It stared at her, sewn lips trembling, the white lantern in its hands now dim and crumbling like ash. Maeve walked toward it. As she neared the glass, the reflection mimicked her, not maliciously, not hungrily, but pleadingly. A thing caught in a page it didn't write. She raised the jar and pressed it to the mirror. The spiral transferred. A brief flare, white-hot, and then the reflection vanished. The glass cracked, and Maeve stepped through, back into her attic, the jar now empty. The story hadn't ended. But for the first time, she was the author again. The hollow did not follow her home. Not right away. For a few days, things were quiet. The spiral on the jar faded, then vanished completely. Her mirrors reflected only what they should. Her voice no longer echoed when she was alone. Even the woods, from her window, seemed still. Maeve almost believed it was over. Until the sky disappeared. It started subtly. The clouds stopped moving. The stars no longer shifted at night. The sun rose in the exact same spot each morning, no drift, no arc, no change in shade or warmth. And when Maeve asked others if they noticed, most gave her blank stares. Then she realized something far worse. People in Black Hollow were forgetting the sky ever changed at all. She stood at the bus stop one afternoon and asked Mrs. Holloway, who was always out feeding birds, if she'd seen the odd stillness above. Mrs. Holloway blinked. Stillness? The sky. It hasn't moved for 3 days. Mrs. Holloway smiled thinly. Why would it? At the market, Maeve pointed out the fixed position of the sun. The grocer laughed. Sun always shines this way, doesn't it? Even her father, when she asked about constellations, grew irritated. You and your stories. It's the sky, Maeve. What's there to change? She stopped asking. That night, she sat on the roof and stared upward. The moon didn't rise. Not late. Not hidden behind clouds. It just wasn't there. As though the sky had been painted on, a flat ceiling stretched above a town too tired to look up. Maeve whispered to herself, it's still writing. She checked the jar. Still empty. But her notebook, the old one she'd nearly abandoned, had begun to fill again. Not with words. Not even drawings, just maps. Dozens of them. Sketched in frantic pencil lines. Most were of Black Hollow, its streets, its old buildings, its forest edge. But as the pages progressed, they showed changes. New roads that curved inward where none existed. Street names she didn't recognize. Symbols etched into the corners. And beyond the forest's edge, a sprawl of dark ink that moved between pages like it was alive. One map showed the sky, flat, gray, cracked like porcelain. And at its center, something drawn in white charcoal, a tear. A vertical rip in the fabric above. Beneath it, scrawled in small, shaky letters, the town has forgotten the sky. The hollow has not. Maeve realized then, the hollow wasn't just in the woods. It was rewriting everything. And the townsfolk, the ones who smiled too much, who blinked too little, were being overwritten too. Rewritten. Only she remembered the stars. The real ones. Only she knew the moon had once moved. And now, only she could find the tear. That night, she took her notebook and flashlight and followed the map that pointed toward the forest's edge. It was silent. Not peaceful. Dead. The trees no longer leaned or whispered. They stood still, unnatural. Sculptures made of rot and memory. Maeve followed the path she'd drawn, a spiral of course, until she reached the place where the map showed the sky's seam. And there it was. Not high above. But low. Hung between two skeletal trees, a shimmer in the air like oil on water. A vertical tear, faint but pulsing, like a wound in the world that had not yet healed. Stars glinted within it, moving stars. Real stars. Maeve reached out. The air around the seam buzzed. A voice, her voice, whispered from inside. You must remember, before it forgets you too. She reached into her coat, pulled out the jar. Still empty. She held it toward the seam. The stars within the tear pulsed once. Then again. And suddenly, the jar filled, not with light, but with a memory. She gasped. It was the sky. The real sky. The sky before the hollow. With moving clouds and dancing aurora and crescent moons that changed shape like breathing. The jar vibrated in her hands. And then, from deep in the woods, she heard footsteps. Not one. Dozens. Slow. Deliberate. The overwritten ones were coming. The town had forgotten the sky. But the hollow remembered. And it wanted to erase what remained. Maeve clutched the jar, turned, and ran. She didn't know how long she had before the memory was taken from her too. But she did know where she had to go next. Back into the pages. Back into the hollow. And this time, she would bring the sky with her. Maeve didn't sleep that night. She sat in her attic, lanterns unlit, staring at the memory in the jar. It pulsed with a rhythm unlike anything else, not a heartbeat, not a clock. It was something older. Like the flicker of the first fire. The way day used to crawl across the sky. The real sky. And in the silence, she remembered the name. From one of the earliest entries in the spiral-bound book. A name written so faintly she hadn't realized its importance until now. The Lantern Maker. Not a person. Not entirely. A scribe of flame and shadow. A weaver of doors. The one who lit the first lantern that had started all this, not just in her life, but in the world that had birthed the Hollow. A storyteller so ancient that even the Hollow had turned on them. Maeve had to find them. Because only the Lantern Maker could show her how to end the Hollow's story without letting it devour hers in return. But the Hollow had grown bolder. The changes were no longer confined to the woods or the sky. That morning, when she stepped outside, the street names were gone. All of them. The signs were still there, wooden posts, metal plaques, but the names had been scrawled over, scrubbed out, or simply never existed to begin with. Even worse, when she tried to walk to the library, she couldn't. The roads looped. Black Hollow had become a maze. A spiral, every path turned her back to the forest. It was hurting her. Maeve ran. She didn't stop to speak. The townsfolk now moved in perfect rhythm, too synchronized to be human. Some stood completely still, staring up at the blank sky with empty eyes. Their lips moved silently, reciting something. She plunged into the woods again. This time, they were ready. The trees bent toward her. Not metaphorically, physically. Branches curved down like claws. Roots shifted underfoot. The Hollow wanted her. And it wasn't hiding anymore. Maeve kept to the map. Through the spiral paths. Until she reached a clearing filled with rusted lanterns, each hanging from crooked metal poles. Hundreds of them. Thousands. No two alike. Some glowed faintly. Others flickered out as she passed. At the center was a tent made of stitched parchment and shadow. She stepped through the flap, and time stopped. Inside, the air was thick with ink and soot. Shelves lined the walls, filled with candles, feathers, broken glass, wax seals, and bones, all sorted by story, not by type. And seated at the far end was the Lantern Maker. They did not look up when she entered. They were binding a lantern, with thread made of light. Their face was obscured by a veil of moth wings. Their fingers moved with unnatural calm. Maeve held out the jar. The Lantern Maker spoke, voice dry and low, "You've brought me a piece of what they tried to erase." Maeve nodded. "It's the sky." "Yes," they said. "And now it's yours to keep or burn." Maeve didn't understand. "Burn?" The Lantern Maker looked up. Behind the moth veil were no eyes, only more lanterns. Tiny, flickering ones, set into the sockets of a face that had been rewritten too many times to remain its own. Every flame here is a story. The Hollow burns them to forget. I bind them to remember. Maeve stepped closer. "Then why help me?" "Because," the Lantern Maker said, "you are the first to bring something back with memory still intact. Most carry fragments. You carry a truth. The Hollow fears truth." They stood. Their form barely touched the ground, but be warned. If you carry this flame too long, it will turn on you too. Maeve hesitated. "What do I do?" The Lantern Maker reached beneath their desk and pulled out an unfinished lantern. It looked like glass and bone fused together. Twisted. Waiting. "You must build a lantern strong enough to carry the sky." Maeve took it in her hands. It was cold. Heavier than it looked. "When it's ready," the Lantern Maker whispered, "climb to the heart of the Hollow. Light it there. And speak your name." "My name?" "The one you were before the stories began." Maeve shook her head. "I don't remember." "Then you must remember before the Hollow does." The Lantern Maker turned away. And when Maeve looked down, she saw that the memory of the sky had already begun to shift. The stars inside the jar blinked slowly, one by one, disappearing. She didn't have long. She had the map. She had the memory. She had the lantern. Now, she needed the name. Maeve left the tent of the lantern maker with the unfinished lantern cradled in her arms. The woods behind her seemed quieter now, but not safer. The hollow had seen her. It knew she'd touched a flame too strong to smother, and it would come for her in new ways, not with claws or whispers, but with something more powerful, forgetfulness. It started at the edges. Small details unraveled like old stitching. The names of her childhood friends. The color of her favorite coat. The way her mother used to hum at the stove before she stopped speaking. Even her own birthday slipped like water through cupped hands. When she spoke it aloud, the numbers felt wrong. Borrowed. The hollow wasn't trying to kill her. It was trying to unmake her. She returned to her attic, where the spiral-bound notebook lay open on the floor. More pages had filled themselves. This time, they were not maps. They were scenes. Memories. Half true, half rewritten. In one, she was a child building a lantern out of pine needles. In another, she stood at a forest's edge with no face. Another showed her sitting in a classroom made of bark and candlelight, the blackboard reading, "Who were you before the ink?" Maeve sat cross-legged and turned page after page. Until she found the one she hadn't drawn. A blank sheet. Except for a single word, burned into the paper, Eloan. Her breath caught. It wasn't a name she'd ever been called, not by family, not by teachers, not in dreams. But the moment she saw it, something inside her shifted. Like a lock turning, a door opening. She whispered it, Eloan. The attic groaned. The lantern in her lap pulsed once, then began to warm. And behind her, she heard the floor creak. Maeve turned. A shadow stood by the doorway. Tall. Faceless. Holding a long, narrow quill made from bone. The ink-wraith. It did not move. It didn't have to. Its presence was enough to thicken the air like syrup. Maeve could feel words sliding out of her head, her name, the sky, the map, unspooling into a fog she couldn't grasp. She reached for the lantern. The memory inside flickered, then steadied. Eloan. 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 She forced the name into her chest like armor. And the wraith recoiled. Its head snapped sideways with a sound like tearing paper. The quill twitched. Its form blurred, not in speed, but like a half-finished sketch being erased line by line. Not yet, Maeve said through her teeth. You don't get to rewrite me. The lantern flared. The room lit up with starlight. The ink-wraith vanished. Not banished. But pushed back, like a wave denied its shore. Maeve gasped for breath, and for a long moment, nothing stirred. She looked down at the lantern. The memory of the sky inside had grown. Where once only a few stars had glimmered, now constellations formed. Lines connected them, shapes she almost remembered from her childhood ceiling stickers. Shooting stars, drifting moons, shimmering auroras. Each one a piece of herself. Of Eloan. And beneath the lantern, burned into the floorboards in curling, smoldering letters, the name has returned. Now light the flame, or be written into someone else. Maeve stood. She gathered her things, the lantern, the notebook, the old jar now dim, and a piece of chalk from the desk drawer. It was time to climb. Time to reach the spiral tree, the heart of the hollow. Time to finish the story. And write her own ending. Maeve, alone now, stepped into the forest as the last remnants of day collapsed behind her. She no longer looked back. The path to the spiral tree was not one she could map. It was not drawn in ink or carved into stone. It shifted. A corridor between memories and metaphors, where footsteps echoed louder than they should and shadows followed rules that light never agreed to. She passed the first gate at dusk, two trees bent together to form an arch, bark spiraling inward like the ridged edge of a thumbprint. Beneath it, the ground grew soft and dark, not dirt, but paper, thin, wrinkled parchment that crinkled underfoot. Every step she took left a boot print of words behind her, She stopped and looked down. The words weren't random. She climbs now. The girl who named herself back. The hollow was watching. Or worse, it was writing again. But Maeve held the lantern close, and its growing light pushed back the curling edges of the forest. The ink wraiths did not return. Not yet. The hollow had shifted tactics. It no longer hunted with fright, it hunted with familiarity. At the second gate, a narrow ravine cut through pages and ash, she saw her mother. Sitting calmly on a wooden chair in the center of the gap, as if waiting for tea. "Eloan," the woman said gently. Maeve flinched. She hadn't heard her name spoken aloud by someone else. But this was not her mother. Not really. She was too still, her eyes too wide. Her smile full of ink. "You came back to us," the mother thing said. "Just like we wrote." Maeve tightened her grip on the lantern. "You're not her." "Oh, but I am. Or I could be. If you'd let the hollow finish." The voice behind the voice. Not the hollow speaking through her mother, but the hollow pretending to be what Eloan loved most. "Let me pass," Maeve said. "There's no need to climb," the figure said, standing now. Her limbs didn't move right. She flowed. "We can write you a softer ending. A gentler version. One where you're warm. Loved. Forgotten." "I'd rather remember," Maeve whispered. And she stepped forward, directly through the illusion. It shattered like wet paper. No scream. No fight. Only silence. At the third gate, the spiral tree finally rose into view. It did not look like a tree at first. More like a tower, grown and twisted from the bones of a forest that had never known sunlight. Its trunk spiraled upward into a canopy that cracked the sky like a needle through velvet. Lanterns of every shape and size hung from its branches, some glowing with faint memories, others long dead. Maeve stepped onto the first root, and the lantern in her hands grew hot. Not burning, alive. Each step up the tree's twisting trunk was harder than the last. The weight of memory pressed down on her shoulders. The sky inside the lantern dimmed and brightened in pulses, like it was breathing. At one point, the wind whispered her forgotten fears. "You'll lose yourself up here. The story's too old for you. You're just another girl with a name she barely owns. Let it go." But Eloan kept climbing. The tree curved, coiled, and narrowed. It should have collapsed under its own spiraling logic, but this was not a place of physics. This was a story. At the top, there was no platform, no door. No audience. Only a single hook. Waiting. Maeve stood at the summit, thousands of feet above the forest floor, with the sky, the real sky, flickering within her lantern. She looked out over Black Hollow, now a gray smear on the edge of oblivion. The town no longer moved. Its people were frozen. The hollow was seconds away from becoming the only truth. She hung the lantern on the hook. And spoke her name. "My name is Eloan." The lantern erupted in light. The memory of the sky burst free, no longer caged, no longer trapped in ink or glass. It poured upward in spirals of blue and golden stars. The sky above the hollow cracked, split, peeled open like the first page of a forgotten book. Clouds began to move again. The stars twitched. The constellations realigned. And the hollow screamed. It screamed not in sound, but in unwritten rage. Because it could not erase her anymore. Eloan had remembered her name. The spiral tree shook beneath her feet, and she knew it was time to descend. But she also knew she would not return the same. The descent was not like the climb. Where before the tree had wound upward in impossible spirals, now it stretched downward like the inside of a throat, slick with shadow, pulsing with ink. Eloan's boots thudded against bark that had become more like pages. Each step left a smudge. Her presence wrote itself into the grain, her name echoing faintly in the rings beneath her feet. Eloan. 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 She descended in silence, lantern light dimming behind her like a chapter ending. But as the sky above healed, the hollow below resisted. It wasn't done. It wouldn't let her go. When her feet touched ground, the woods no longer resembled themselves. Trees had folded inward. Streets bled into rivers of words. The houses of Black Hollow lay half-sunk, tilting like broken tombstones. The townsfolk were gone, or worse, rewritten. Some wandered with pages stapled to their skin. Others stood still, whispering memories that weren't theirs. A man recited his daughter's birth over and over, but his voice trembled with uncertainty, the details shifting each time. And the sky still held its breath. Not fully restored. Still cracked at the edges. Because the hollow had one final page to turn. At the heart of the town square, the ground split open. Not a hole, a book. Its spine cracked and torn, its pages vast as fields. The ink inside it writhed like a nest of snakes. Words leapt from line to line, forming sentences, then erasing them in fury. And rising from its center was the hollow itself. No longer hiding in trees or dreams or silence. Now, it had a shape, a body stitched from unfinished stories. Its skin a tapestry of tales that had been lost, erased, stolen. Its face ever-changing, one moment her teacher, the next her sister, then her reflection. It carried the quill of the inkwraiths in one hand and the book of all forgotten names in the other. It looked at her with eyes made of empty lines. "You have defied your page," it said. Its voice echoed without echo, like something mimicking a voice rather than owning one. "You lit the sky. You remembered. But memory is not immunity. You belong to us still." Eloan stepped forward. Her hands trembled, but she did not falter. "I am not a sentence you get to end." The hollow raised the quill. And the world shuddered. The book beneath her feet flipped open, pages flaring with wind and whispers. Her name appeared, Eloan Kestrel, written cleanly at first, then slowly overwritten by thicker, Messier ink, Maya Greaves. Iris Linden. Jane Doe. Girl number 317. It was trying to drown her in identities. Trying to override her again. But Eloan reached into her satchel and pulled out the last piece the lantern maker had given her, a piece she had not used during the climb. A blank page. Not just paper, a seed of authorship. She held it in both hands and shouted over the rising wind, "You told stories to erase me. I will write one to remember." And she tore the page in two. The hollow screamed. Not from pain, from panic. Because the page had not been blank after all. It had absorbed her truths. Her choices. Her resistance. It was her rewrite, and now it unraveled through the hollow's book like a virus, curling into every line, every footnote, every lie. Eloan's true name etched itself into the roots of the hollow. Not just her name, her story. One not dictated by fear or fog or forgetfulness, but by defiance. The hollow lunged. She did not run. The lantern, now unlit, still hung warm on her belt. She lifted it one last time and whispered, "This is my ending. And you don't get to write it." She threw the lantern into the heart of the book. A final burst of starlight tore through the black ink. The hollow caught fire from the inside out, not with flame, but with memory. Real ones. True ones. All it had devoured poured back out, childhoods, lullabies, faces once forgotten. The sky above ripped open fully, letting through stars no one had seen in years. The hollow writhed. Then crumbled. Then. It was over. Morning came like it hadn't in years. Not the thin, sour daylight that once filtered through the hollow's haze, but real, living light. Golden and cold, like spring air on old stone. It poured through cracked windows. It soaked the soil. It warmed the roofs of homes that no longer whispered. And in the center of the town, where the hollow's book had cracked open like a wound, there was now only a field of quiet grass. Eloan sat beneath the spiral tree's roots, the very base of it, now shrunken back into the forest's edge like a retreating tide. The tree no longer pulsed with darkness or whispered half-truths. It had become what it was always meant to be, a memory. Behind her, the townsfolk stirred. They emerged slowly from their houses, confused, blinking at the sky. Some held pieces of paper, Others carried broken lanterns that now sparked faintly with color. They didn't remember everything, not yet, but the emptiness inside them was gone. Their names had come back. A woman whispered her daughter's full name and cried. A boy recited his birthday like a spell. Old men touched their hands and counted every scar, every wrinkle, saying, "This was mine. This was always mine." Eloan watched them. She did not wave. She didn't want to be seen as something other than what she was, a girl who remembered when it mattered most. The lantern maker was gone. So was the attic, and the chalk circle, and the inktrace who had hunted between breaths. What remained was the lantern. Still whole. Still warm. It lay beside her on the grass, filled with a gentle, pulsing glow, not the vast sky, not a blazing memory, but a soft, golden light. The kind you could fall asleep beside. The kind you could follow home. She picked it up one last time and turned it in her hands. And saw something new etched into the glass. The story is told. But stories do not end. They sleep. And wait to be lit again. Eloan stood, brushed off her coat, and walked. Not back into town, but toward the forest, where the hollow had once begun. The path curved beneath boughs now full of songbirds. Stones no longer whispered, the trees did not lean to listen. But the lantern stayed lit. Not with fear. Not even with memory. But with peace. She passed the final arch, 2 trees that had once bent inward to trap her, and stepped out into sunlight. It was mid-morning. The road stretched far. She didn't look back, and in the attic of an old house no longer haunted, a book closed gently on its own. The candle flickered. And the hollow fell silent. The end.